All right, another attempt, let's say, as Leo Strauss did in some of his class sessions, the expressionistic attempt. So, in other words, I don't just give a report on something, but neither do I carry out an exacting investigation in the strict sense. Just look. I tried to find the avenue of invasion that Heidegger found in some way where we catch like the essence. There is the concept of the essence is in question, whether we know what it means. It could mean there are things that were supposed to be in the minds of the gods which for us become intelligible through for instance looking at a statue which shows the Nike at Samothrace, for instance, all those sort of flamboyantly undulating folds which sort of indicate there's somehow, if a thing is, I suppose the Nike at Samothrace if a feminine figure is sort of more done up, the hair and the folds on the robes, there's more pathos at stake somehow. If this figure were to fall, I mean, if, for instance, if Cleopatra, for instance, so Cleopatra, the name means something like Kleos of the patri, of the fathers. Remember, after World War II, we had this so-called counter-proposal to the sort of UN liberal order by de Gaulle, because de Gaulle called for the Europa dei Patri, the Europe of the fatherlands. The name Cleopatra is like the glory of the fathers somehow. And if such a person were to be, after the city is sacked or whatever, handed over to the enemy, then there's something, and say, sort of spoliated, as it were. I don't mean just turned into a concubine or raped, but I mean somehow her hair's torn out. She tears her own hair out, and in outward sign of her anguish, something like that. It's more pathetic if it's sort of the pride of women is involved somehow in this full sense of having this certain sort of hairstyle. I mean, if you're living in France in the 18th century or something, you know what the hairstyle of the mistress of one of the sons of Louis the 15th or whatever, who she is and how she has her hair, how she's coiffed or whatever. And then, these things, they're part of the is. But then Heidegger wants to say, when we isolate a subject matter like that, already we're not talking about the is that can't be said, and which corresponds to philosophy in the sense that he says phenomenology, for him, he says, in Husserl, phenomenology was kind of a cry to stop slipping up, take things seriously and check everything, and don't make the for instance, the error of psychologism, which Husserl was very anxious not to commit, and then, according to Heidegger, did still commit. But rather, phenomenology for Heidegger is the only science that has no subject matter. But yet, nonetheless, we could say phenomenology, as the only science that has a subject matter, has been ontically defined, as it were. It's been given a determination, and it's been presented as, in a way, as a region. I think as the region through the notion of Dasein. So that's a sign that Heidegger, you see, when Heidegger talks, people make such a big and long journey into the Maison Abîme, into that Valencois painting, the canvas, the oil paints on that canvas, and they start sinking into it in this sort of sense, like the MC Escher staircase and this type of thing. It's both that, and even say if MC Escher's staircase could be expressed as asymptotically moving towards a vanishing point, so that it wasn't just that you didn't know what was up and what was down, but that it was also some kind of vertigo effect. You get a situation where the ontic, and then that what I just said is we could analogize and think with the Catholics who say that ousia being, or as it were, substance, or ousia understood as being as the Genus Supremus. Is that how they say it? Genus Suprema? Not sure. But in any case, it's the widest genus. This view that's also associated with Kant's, Immanuel Kant's dismissal of the reality of being for the, in order to say there's not the there's rather only the logical form, which is, say, the form according to the logos, or is as the couple of the sentence with this particular meaning. I think also by following Kant that way, we get to the problem of the predication, where Heidegger saying, predication, it's another form in a way for Heidegger of the move into this Maison Abîme of ontic attempts to get the different scales, this historical scale. Let's talk according to the notion of external investigation, or history, but nonetheless applied to reading of text, Stephen Kotkin or whatever. If I were doing something else, I could just make it up, but since I'm a historian, then I have to tell you according to the Saka, according to the Tatsaka, according to the the very thing, as it were, the things, the objectivity, the Sheehan says objectivity, or objectively, the language speaks, predication speaks objectively, according to Heidegger. That's the way he translates Saka. I say the things, according to the things. But what could have said the facts, the objects, the things, the subject matter, the state of affairs, and one could refer to all variety of things, such as the correct construal of a legal command, and with a sort of disappearing refinement, also to casuistry, also to reading the case out of the principle into the temporal, into the so-called daily life. But so we could see actually Heidegger does begin his question within the horizon of the so-called ontic, but he just sort of says, but this is the one spot that hasn't yet been defined, and therefore the being is always escaping definition in this sense. And then if we every time we look at the ontic case, and that's not the is, but that's insufficient to look at it through this sort of abstract way of presenting. He's trying to say either he senses the sort of musical tonality of the what's at stake there, or the essence of it, or the essencing of it, or the however this should be presented after, if we dispense with the concept of essence. But remembering that Heidegger says with the thinker, it's really that they have one main idea, and then everything else is much less important. To become a scholar on the thinker is important, but it's also part of the many and not the one, as it were. But it's exactly this particular treatment of the many and the one in the Sein Daseyendes version that's quite different. And I think that it contains a Heideggerian paradox, which is that just as in Nietzsche, you get Nietzsche says, talks about the life-giving lie, and talks about saying it's sort of like the life-giving lie is true, but he at the same time says there is no truth. But is it true that there is no truth? You got to get into the paradox, right? And then his point is sort of like the Übermensch is the one that can sort of withstand that, and that's their native atmosphere. They don't succumb to the... they inoculate themselves against that paradox, but then reach some kind of higher presentation. Or we don't know what happens to them. But anything else Nietzsche thinks would be a cop-out and not to face up to the problem. But then at Heidegger, from a lot of angles that aren't Heidegger's own angle, and I think sometimes Heidegger despairs over it, we seem to see it's sort of like, well, I guess let's say we have the seventh letter of Plato, right? So whether or not it's legitimately written by Plato, I'm not totally sure. But just the idea there of the fire leaping from the branch to the branch. It doesn't. It doesn't have to directly. The trees don't have to directly touch, but then they heat up and it ignites on the other tree without it even leaping from branch to branch. It leaps metaphorically, but it leaps through the transmission of the heat to the neighboring tree, and then we speak of the mines on fire, right? And then the neighboring tree heats up until the combustion happens, but separately. Yeah, so we have there a picture of how this Heideggerian insight would transfer not from Dasein to Dasein, but to whatever corresponds to what we can't express. Because as soon as we try to say it in that way as a pair, we end up in the same. There is no truth has to be true or false, and or nothing. These simple statements like nothing is impossible. You say, except when you say nothing is impossible. You imply that it's impossible for something to be impossible. which can't fail to sort of make us question the status of the ground of the very concept of dunamis, or possibility, as Heidegger did in his metaphysics theta. But that's just bookmark this as again. Sometimes you have to be a little bit, modernist in order to, or avant-garde, early 20th century avant-garde. That's the correct term. We're not even yet at Le Corbusier or anything modern. But you have to try different paths of invasion, I think.